Verse 454. The world originates from habit energy. There is nothing whatever to be designated as being and non-being, nor is there its negation. Those who see into this are emancipated as they understand the egolessness of things. This verse is very much about our relationship with the world. Our relationship with the world determines the extent to which we are in bondage or the extent to which we are liberated or emancipated. And we're told here that the world originates from habit energy. In modern times, we tend to think of the world as a rather indifferent, external, scientific even, stage, backdrop upon which we try and work out our own personal dramas. And it's this attitude, this assumption even, that needs to be questioned. We have this idea about the world, but it's not the world that we actually relate to. What we relate to is our response to the world, our response to this idea of the world even. This idea of the world promotes notions of struggle, of grabbing your piece of the pie, of establishing yourself, of finding your own secure little corner where you can perhaps live out the rest of your days without much interference or trouble. Or perhaps it's you want to get everybody on the stage to notice your own personal dramas. Whatever approach we take, this is a result of what's described here as our habit energy. Our habit energy is our consistent way of looking at things, our consistent way of feeling, the consistent way that we feel about things. This is the world we actually live in, the world of our habit energy, the world of our own understanding, of our own feelings, of our own moods. This is the world we live in, not some cool, impartial, scientific understanding of the world. So we need to look into this. We need to look into our relationship with the world, the very assumptions that we quietly make, the unconscious assumptions that we make. One of the assumptions that we make is that there are separate things in the world and they come and go. The words used here are being and non-being. We tend not to think in terms of being and non-being as such, but this is exactly what we do. We try and build up the so-called reality of the world by saying it's got a history. Things come into being, things go out of being. At one point I came into being, and at another point I'll go out of being. This is the history that we see of ourselves. This is the history that we see in terms of ourselves, and we assume that history of every other part of the world. The earth itself came into being at some point in the past, and at some point in the future it will disappear from being. You might think, well, of course, that's pretty obvious. But this is a story that we tell ourselves. It's a story that we assume. It's a story by which we give reality to what is apparently going on. You can see this very process at work quite clearly when you consider the phenomenon of dreams. When you're in a dream, that's what's real. You can't question it. You can only question it afterwards, after you've woken up from the dream. But when you're in the dream, it's very difficult to question it. It's so real. We don't believe for a minute, for a second even, that it sprung into existence at that moment. It's got a history. There are things in that dream. There are people coming and going. There's space, there's a landscape, a scenario, a stage. I have a history. I'll meet people that have got a history. There are things that have got a history. There's being and non-being. This sense of history is part of what makes it real. We can't accept that it's just come into being, although it has. As far as we know, it came into being at that very moment. It's being sustained from moment to moment. This is how consciousness works. This is how consciousness reinforces the reality of what's presented to it. So we have to wake up from this. There is neither being nor non-being. And we're told here, nor is there its negation. It's very often misunderstood in spiritual terms by saying that the world is false. The world does not exist. It's an illusion. Well, there is a world. There's something obviously going on, isn't there? So we can't say it doesn't exist. But what is false is our relationship with it. That's what's false. That's what's deluded. That's delusion. It's how we think, how we believe the world to be. So we cannot deny the world. We can't say the world doesn't exist. What we need to look at is our relationship with that world. That's what's false. That's what's deluded. We have to look at the very assumptions that we make about it. This is the way to emancipation. It's when you realize that it's all consciousness at play, just as a dream is consciousness at play. It's indulging in its dramas. This is what happens in a dream. None of the things in the dream have an individual identity. What's described here as ego, whether individuals or things. Ego in the sense of a thing is the assumption that there's some underlying reality behind it. A mountain in a dream has no underlying reality behind it. It's something that is created in that moment. This is what consciousness does. It's what it's doing right now. Dreams are a useful analogy for understanding how consciousness works. Dreams are a useful insight into understanding how consciousness works. And we need to see this for ourselves in the waking state. When we come back to our own sense of being, the sense that it's our own awareness that's real, our own consciousness that's real, rather than the play of consciousness. We first of all have to step back from our own habit energy, step back from our own moods, our own understandings. We have to step back from our relationship with the world. And we can do this by realizing that everything is happening here. There is not an objective external world. There is on practical, everyday, conventional terms, and we have to go along with that. But when we're practicing enlightenment, we can stop all that. We can stop these games. We can come back to the rich, liberating fullness of our own awareness. Not so much our own awareness, of course, but that awareness which is consciousness itself. Consciousness which dreams, consciousness which is awake, and consciousness which is liberated.